Report 1. Tom Higgins, a 55-year-old man, was a living legend among Pennsylvania hikers. Since he was 12, he knew every curve, every stone, and every tree along the trails that wind through the Appalachian Trail. On that gray autumn morning, the air carried a light mist that enshrouded the woods in a mysterious veil. The weather was damp, and the wind whispered through the trees with an almost eerie tone, as if the forest itself was murmuring ancient secrets. The sky, laden with thick clouds, threatened an imminent storm, but Tom, with his indomitable spirit, decided to press on. The trail passed through an isolated stretch of Yellow Creek, a narrow river whose dark waters ran silent and deep. The old wooden bridge crossing the river creaked under his feet, and the sound echoed like a warning through the tree-covered hills. The smell of wet earth and moss invaded his nostrils as he advanced. Tom had heard various stories about the area. Friends who had taken the same trail spoke of strange sightings in the sky, mysterious lights that danced among the treetops, and sounds that echoed in the middle of the night, like howls from something that was neither wolf nor bear. The most famous local legend was of a being that inhabited the woods around Yellow Creek. Some said it was a Sasquatch, others an ancient Native American entity, a guardian of the mountains. Some swore they had seen glowing eyes lurking from the darkness, always watching, but never fully revealing itself. Before we proceed with more terror stories, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to our channel and click like if you're enjoying the content. Your interaction is crucial for us to continue unraveling mysteries that challenge our reality. Don't forget to comment below which city you are watching from, to know how far our stories are reaching. When Tom crossed the bridge and reached the other side, something immediately caught his attention: an abandoned campsite. There was a small worn green shelter, with a torn sleeping bag and a pair of old boots, their laces loose, hanging like a sinister riddle. What disturbed him most was the scene of disorder. It looked like someone had left in a hurry, leaving everything behind. Supplies were scattered on the ground, as if thrown carelessly. There were no clear signs that a wild animal had done this, which only heightened Tom's unease. He began to walk slowly, his heart beating faster. The silence was almost absolute, except for the faint rustling of leaves above. Yet, something disturbed this quietude. He felt he was not alone. His ears, trained by years of hunting, picked up a low, distant, but continuous sound. Someone, or something, was following him. Tom stopped, frozen. The sound stopped with him. He continued, and the footsteps, heavier than any animal he had ever heard, followed him. A chill ran through his entire body as the dense metallic smell of something unknown hung in the air. He was in unfamiliar territory, even for someone as acquainted with those forests as he was. He knew he should continue walking until he found a safe place to camp, but the feeling of being hunted did not leave him. Some friends told stories of something big and dark lurking among the trees, but Tom had never taken those stories seriously. Now, he began to reconsider. He walked another 5 miles until he found a small clearing protected by large trees that seemed to guard the space like ancient sentinels. He quickly set up his camp, keeping the fire going, and stayed alert to the sounds of the forest, which seemed to intensify as night fell. The wind howled among the trees, as if something was trying to communicate. The heavy sound of footsteps returned. This time, much closer. Much, much closer. Tom looked up at the sky, partially obscured by the tree canopies, and saw something that froze his blood, an intense light moving erratically on the horizon, as if it was being controlled by something not human. He was paralyzed, watching the light disappear into the mountains. His heart was racing. That's when he heard it, a deep guttural growl coming from the darkness, not far away. Suddenly, something huge emerged from the shadows. A tall, dark figure with long arms and an odd gait. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a wolf. It was something much bigger, and it was moving toward him on 2 feet. Tom looked up, and what he saw made his entire body freeze with fear. The sky, partially covered by the tree canopies, seemed to hide something that shouldn't be there. It was a light, intense and blinding, moving with a speed and precision that defied any logical explanation. It wasn't the kind of light he had seen in planes or satellites. It didn't follow a linear or predictable path. Instead, it zigzagged between the clouds, as if it was searching for something, or someone. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The wind ceased, the leaves stopped moving, and even the sound of crickets dissolved into an oppressive silence. Tom was paralyzed, his heart beating so fast he could feel it throbbing in his temples. He tried to rationalize what he was seeing, perhaps a shooting star, an atmospheric reflection. But nothing explained that light. It was as if an invisible presence was controlling whatever that was, a presence that didn't belong to that place. The light shone intensely one last time before disappearing behind the distant mountains, as if it had fulfilled some kind of purpose. The deep silence that followed was interrupted by a sound that seemed to come from the very belly of the earth, a deep, guttural growl echoing among the trees, growing in volume like an approaching storm. Tom quickly turned around, his eyes wide searching for the source of the sound. It wasn't far. In fact, it came from somewhere very close, hidden by the deep darkness of the forest. Suddenly, the shape emerged from the shadows. It was gigantic, much larger than anything he had seen in his years of hunting and exploration. It was as if the forest itself had given life to a nightmare. The figure was black as night, with disproportionately long arms that swung by its side as it walked. Its legs were sturdy, but what really made Tom's blood freeze was the gait. It wasn't that of a four-legged animal, like a bear, but of something that walked upright, like a man. Yet, that being was far from human. The sound of heavy footsteps crushing the dry ground was almost rhythmic, each impact making the ground vibrate under Tom's feet. His heart seemed to want to jump out of his chest. The nauseating smell of something rotten and metallic took over the air, as if the creature itself exhaled the essence of death. Closer and closer, the sinister presence approached. Its eyes, two bright, malevolent orbs, reflected the faint light of the fire, but they didn't bring any sign of life. On the contrary, they were like windows to something beyond, something indescribably ancient and predatory. Tom, with trembling, sweaty hands, desperately tried to arm himself with the pepper spray he always carried for emergencies. His fingers fumbled around the cylinder, and he finally squeezed the trigger in the direction of the creature. The chemical jet ricocheted ineffectively, as if the monster was immune. The creature took a few more steps, getting closer and closer, and Tom could hear the sound of its heavy breathing, almost as if it was savoring the fear emanating from him. The heat from the being's body, even at a distance, was palpable, almost suffocating. The creature then stopped. Tom froze, holding the little breath he had left. Time seemed to distort again. The two stood there motionless, as if they were in a silent duel. Then the monster growled once more, a sound so deep and resonant that the trees around seemed to tremble. Tom's panic increased, and he, in a last act of desperation, lit an improvised torch and threw it at the creature. The light of the flames briefly illuminated its face, or what seemed to be a face, a grotesque blur of shadows, teeth, and skin black as the night. With a furious roar, the creature recoiled, beating its long arms against the ground as it disappeared into the darkness, its footsteps echoing farther and farther until they merged with the sound of the returning wind, as if it had never been there. The silence that followed was deafening. Tom was alone again, but he knew that the peace he felt was just a temporary illusion. The next morning, the sun didn't seem to bring relief. The air was still heavy, as if the very environment carried the memory of that night. Tom dismantled the camp in a hurry, the tension still present in every muscle of his body. As he walked back along the trail, trying to shake off the feeling that he was being watched, he noticed something hanging from a tree, a piece of fabric. But it wasn't just any piece of fabric. It was recent, and its fabric was intact, as if it had been placed there on purpose, as a warning. Right below, deep footprints marked the hard ground. They were too large to be from a man, and they made no sense at all. The footprints followed the trail for a few meters and then suddenly disappeared, as if whatever had made them had simply evaporated into the air. Tom stopped for a moment, his stomach churning with nervousness. He looked around, at the trees, at the path ahead. The feeling of being watched still persisted, as real as the wind blowing in his face. He knew deep down that the creature was still there, hidden in the shadows, waiting. Maybe it had never left. Back in town, Tom told the story to some friends. They listened with skeptical looks, but there was something in the tone of his voice, something in the dark and scary details of his account, that made them think twice before laughing. He never returned to that part of the forest, but the memory of the creature, and the light in the sky, never left him. He wondered, almost every night, what would have happened if he hadn't lit the torch. Deep down he knew that the creature, whatever it was still there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. And in a way, Tom knew that the encounter he had survived might not have the same outcome the next time. The mountains carry secrets, and he had ventured too close to a mystery that perhaps should never have been unraveled. The mystery of the mountains still persists. Report 2. Emily Harris, a 66-year-old woman, was one of those restless souls who never let life's challenges get her down. After a decades-long career as a nurse caring for others, she decided it was time to do something for herself. Emily always loved nature, and the Appalachian Trail had been a distant dream, an epic challenge that seemed to call to her. Her husband had passed away a few years earlier, and her children had their own lives. With her family's support, she decided she would finally complete the trail spanning over 2,200 miles across 14 states. But there was something deeper motivating her. Emily saw this journey as a way to reconnect with herself, to face her fears and find a kind of inner peace. The Appalachian Trail would be her liberation, the culmination of her search for purpose after the pain of loss. She began her hike in April, accompanied by her longtime friend, Janet, who shared the same adventurous spirit. They laughed, talked, and walked, but knew that the trail was treacherous. With every step, the stories of other hikers echoed in their minds. Tales of strange encounters, of mysterious lights that blinked in the mountains, of unexplainable sounds that seemed to emanate from the emptiness of the forest. Emily, however, didn't believe in those legends. For her, it was just nature. And its mysteries, nothing more. She was there to overcome her own limits, not to be intimidated by superstitions. But as the months passed and the trails became more isolated and challenging, Emily began to feel the loneliness of that place. The wind among the trees, the long stretches without a single soul in sight, the distant sound of animals moving in the shadows, everything seemed to be whispering something she couldn't understand. When Janet had to leave the trail due to a family emergency, Emily decided to continue alone. After all, she had already covered over 1,000 miles. What could go wrong? On a fateful day in July, in the midst of one of the densest and most remote areas of the trail, she decided to take a brief break for a quick need in the woods, straying a few meters from the main path. It was during this small detour that fate changed for Emily. When she finished and tried to return to the trail, she realized she had completely lost her sense of direction. The trees looked identical in every direction. The sky was cloudy, and the dense vegetation obscured any point of reference. Panic began to emerge like a creeping cold that ran down her spine. Emily was lost. With no cell signal and time running out, Emily began to search for a way out, but the more she walked, the more the forest enveloped her. The sun set, and darkness took over. The first nights were a struggle between hope and despair. She set up a small shelter with the materials she had and tried to keep the fire going. The silence of the forest at night was almost oppressive. And then the sounds began. On the second night, Emily heard a distant rustling. Initially, she thought it might be a common animal, perhaps a deer or a squirrel, but the sound was too heavy, too deep. Whatever was moving out there was large and moved slowly, as if deliberately circling her camp. Her breathing quickened, and she tried to convince herself she was exaggerating. But the sound continued, heavy resonant footsteps breaking dry branches. The air began to smell different, a pungent, metallic odor, like ammonia. In the following days, the sounds became more frequent. Emily kept a diary, documenting every moment of her anguish. The pages were filled with accounts of those inexplicable noises, the constant feeling of being watched. In one entry, she described something that made her shudder. "It's not a bear. I know what a bear sounds like. This is something different. Something watching me, waiting for me. I can smell it. It's ammonia, almost unbearable." One night, As the wind blew through the treetops, Emily tried in vain to force herself to sleep. The warmth of the fire had dissipated, and the silence that had fallen over the forest was frightening. It wasn't just the absence of sounds, it was the kind of silence that screams, that makes the mind desperately search for any noise, any sign that the world around is still alive. But that night, the world seemed to have stopped. The air was heavy, dense, as if something invisible had sucked it into the earth itself. Suddenly, she felt it. It wasn't an imaginary sensation, not a product of her exhaustion. It was real, tangible. Something or someone lightly brushed her leg over the sleeping bag. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding, her ears alert for any sign of movement. Her breathing was short and erratic. It must have been the wind, she tried to tell herself, but rationalization wasn't enough to contain the shiver running down her spine. She looked around. The fire had almost completely gone out, leaving only embers that emitted a faint orange light. But what made her freeze with fear wasn't the darkness. It was the smell. The strong, penetrating odor of ammonia again invaded the air, so dense it seemed to burn her nostrils. She stood up, but there was nothing there. Nothing that her eyes could see, at least. But the smell continued, as if it were ingrained in the very forest, in the very soul of that place. Emily began to record everything in her diary. It was her only way to maintain sanity. In those pages, she started to report what was happening to her, the strange dreams that haunted her in the few hours of sleep she managed to get. In her nightmares, a gigantic creature chased her. Its eyes glowed in the dark, reflecting a light that shouldn't exist in the forest. Its long, inhuman arms swung as it slowly approached, as if it were enjoying the despair of its prey. Emily always woke up sweating cold, the smell of ammonia ingrained around, as if the creature wasn't just a figment of her mind, but something that was really there waiting for her. Watching. As the days passed, physical and emotional exhaustion began to take over. Her skin was covered in scratches, marks she couldn't remember how she had acquired. They were deep, as if she had struggled, fought against something. But what? She didn't know. Her mind was confused, increasingly weak. Her nights were populated by nightmares, and her days became a constant struggle to survive. The food was running out, the water too, and the forest seemed increasingly oppressive. She began to wonder if what she was feeling was real or a product of her exhaustion. The marks on her body, so vivid, deep, like scars of a desperate fight, only increased her terror. "I am being hunted," she wrote with a trembling hand on one of the last pages of her diary. "I don't know what it is, but I feel its presence. I hear its footsteps. I see its eyes, when I close mine. But the smell is always here. It envelopes me, suffocates me. I can't escape." The following nights were a mix of terror and agony. The smell of ammonia was not only present, it seemed to intensify, as if the creature was getting closer. Emily could barely sleep. Every noise, no matter how small, made her wake up startled, and the sound of breaking branches in the distance was like someone stepping through them. Walking around her, getting a little closer each time. She knew deep down that she was on the verge of something terrible, something the human mind should not confront. The only thing that had kept her going until that point was the desire to fight, to survive. But even that was beginning to fade. She wrote in her diary one more time, her handwriting shaky and almost illegible, "I tried. I fought. But he is real. I can feel his presence. He watches me. He is coming." Those were her last written words. That night, as darkness seemed to devour the little light that remained, Emily heard the final sound. Footsteps. Heavier than before, closer, echoing like drum beats. She did not run, for there was no strength left in her legs. She knew she could not escape. Her body was broken, her mind exhausted. The smell of ammonia was now unbearable, almost suffocating, filling the air with a density that pressed on her chest. And then, silence fell again. Two years later, her body was found, just 2 kilometers from the Appalachian Trail. The state of decomposition was advanced, but some marks remained evident on her skin. They were deep scratches, cuts that seemed more the result of a fierce struggle than simple falls or natural abrasions. Something or someone had left its mark on her. And the smell. When the rescuers arrived at the site, it was still possible to smell the ammonia in the air. Emily's diary was found next to her body, intact, its last words like an indecipherable puzzle. The authorities tried to rationalize the death, claiming that Emily probably succumbed to isolation and the elements of nature. But those who read her last words could not ignore what she had described. The marks on her body were not normal. The smell of ammonia did not make sense. Something more was in that forest, something she encountered, or that found her. To this day, hikers who pass through that area report strange sensations. Some claim to feel watched, as if something invisible is following them. Others describe a strong smell of ammonia, coming from nowhere, appearing and disappearing inexplicably. The bravest claim to hear heavy footsteps, always at a distance but close enough to freeze the blood. Emily Harris's story has become a legend among hikers of the Appalachian Trail. A grim reminder that the forest, for all its beauty, can also harbor dark and unfathomable secrets. And while the mystery of her death was never solved, one thing remains clear: there is something in that forest, something that is still there. And like Emily, those who dare to walk those trails may one day encounter what she did. Or worse, they may not survive to tell the tale. In that dense and shadowy forest, the legend of Emily Harris became more than just a story. For those who knew her, it was a painful and inexplicable mystery. For hikers who heard about her tragic journey, it was a silent warning: the forest is not just a refuge for peace and reflection. It is alive, ancient, and full of secrets that few have the courage to face head-on. After the discovery of Emily's body, the trail leading to the clearing where her remains were found was marked as a place avoided by many. The trees seemed taller and darker in that stretch, and even the sounds of birds seemed to cease when someone approached. Strange reports began to emerge among those who passed by, but no one dared to talk much about it, as if the mere act of telling these stories could invoke something indescribable. One of the first accounts came from a young hiker named Mark, who was just 23 years old. He was inexperienced but eager to conquer the Appalachian Trail. As he passed the spot where Emily had been found, Mark felt a strange sensation, a sudden chill, despite the warmth of the day. The smell of ammonia was the first thing he noticed, so strong that it made him stop in the middle of the trail. He described the smell as something that seemed to stick to his skin, invading his nostrils in a way that made him choke. Trying to ignore it, he continued to walk, but felt something was wrong. He turned around several times, convinced something was following him, but there was nothing there, at least, nothing he could see. That night, when he set up camp about a kilometer from where Emily's body had been found, Mark was awakened by the sound of breaking branches. He described the sound as slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was walking around his camp, studying him. He got up with his heart racing, feeling invisible eyes fixed on him. He grabbed his flashlight and illuminated the surroundings, but all he saw were shadows dancing to the rhythm of the wind. However, the smell of ammonia was back, and this time it was unbearable. He described how the air seemed to become heavy, hard to breathe. The sound of footsteps was approaching, louder and closer. It was then that he realized the sound was not just around his camp. It was coming from the darkness, and it seemed to be moving in his direction. Desperate, Mark grabbed what he could and began to run through the forest, not even bothering to dismantle his camp. During his escape, he said he heard a deep guttural growl that followed him for several minutes as he distanced himself from the area. He didn't know what it was, but it didn't seem human. He ran until dawn when he finally reached a group of other hikers and collapsed, exhausted, telling the story between gasps for breath. They laughed at his account, but Mark's eyes showed something that could not be ignored. He believed he had escaped something beyond comprehension. Months passed, but the reports continued. A group of 3 hikers, who decided to spend the night near the spot where Emily had disappeared, experienced something similar. They awoke in the early morning to sounds of something dragging through the dry leaves around their tent. When one of them went out to check, they found large footprints on the ground, impressions so deep they seemed impossible to have been made by a common animal. But what terrified them even more was the strange absence of forest sounds. No birds, no crickets, just the heavy silence that seemed to suffocate. Upon returning to town, one of the hikers, a seasoned veteran named John, began to feel strange. He described a sensation of being constantly watched, even when he was alone in his house. Days later, John suddenly fell ill, with a high fever and vivid nightmares. He said he saw the creature in his dreams, a tall, shadowy figure with disproportionately long arms and eyes that glowed in the dark. Each night, the smell of ammonia invaded his home, and he awoke sweating cold, as if something was in the room with him. A week later, John was found dead in his home. The cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but the mystery did not stop there. When his body was examined, strange marks were discovered on his skin, deep scratches that did not correspond to common injuries. Once again, the smell of ammonia was present in the room where he was found, impregnating the walls in a way that no one could explain. The mystery of what really happened to Emily and to those who passed through the area after her death continues. The marks on the body, the inexplicable smell, the sounds echoing through the forest. All of it remains unanswered. People avoid talking much about it, as if acknowledging the existence of this invisible force were opening a door that should remain closed. But one thing is certain, those who walk those trails never leave the same. Some return mute, unable to describe what they experienced. Others carry with them the traumas of inexplicable encounters, stories they refuse to tell for fear that the mere act of speaking might bring back the creature that still lurks in the shadows. And so, the legend of Emily Harris continues to grow, shrouded in mystery and terror. What did she encounter that fateful night in the depths of the forest? What was watching her from the shadows, patiently waiting to strike? And most disturbingly of all, is that force still lurking, just waiting for its next victim? The answers may never be known, but for those who dare to walk the Appalachian Trail, the warning is always clear. Something older than time, something beyond comprehension, still inhabits those mountains. And like Emily, those who venture too deeply into that territory may never return, or worse, may come back forever marked, carrying with them the dark secrets of the forest. Report 3. Luca Bianchi, a 56-year-old Italian, has always been passionate about outdoor adventures. Since his youth, he was known for his bravery and thirst for exploration, whether climbing mountains in Italy or traversing isolated trails in Europe. Luca had become an experienced hiker, participating in various expeditions and treks on challenging terrains, always in search of the adrenaline and sense of freedom that contact with nature provided. In January 2018, after hearing so many stories and legends about the Appalachian Trail, he decided it was time to take on one of the most iconic and feared challenges by adventurers around the world. The Appalachian Trail, a trail that snakes through 14 American states and stretches over 2,200 miles, has always been shrouded in mystery. Stories of hikers who disappeared without a trace, mysterious lights that illuminate the night, and encounters with otherworldly beings have circulated for decades among those who dared to set foot on that soil. However, Luca was skeptical. To him, these were just stories to scare the faint-hearted. He was experienced and rational, confident that his preparation and skills would lead him to successfully complete the journey. Luca's trip started well, and he was enchanted by the wild beauty of the Pennsylvania mountains and forests. Winter had transformed the landscape into a dreamlike setting, with snow covering the trees and the silence of nature only broken by the sound of his own footsteps. But as he advanced along the trail, something began to change. The atmosphere around him seemed to transform. The air, once fresh and invigorating, became heavy, almost oppressive. It was as if the forest itself was watching every move he made, and the silence became disturbing, like a harbinger of something sinister. On the lonely nights in his tent, Luca began to notice something strange. In the sky, above the trees, bright lights danced erratically. They were not stars or planes. They moved quickly, disappeared, and reappeared in different spots, as if they were watching him. The first time he saw them, Luca dismissed it as hallucinations caused by fatigue. But the lights returned, night after night, and each time closer. One of those nights, he woke up abruptly, his heart racing, after dreaming he was being followed. It was a strange nightmare, but what terrified him was the feeling that, upon opening his eyes, something was standing outside his tent, watching him. The next morning, Luca noticed something even more disturbing. strange footprints on the ground around his camp. They were not the footprints of common animals. They were large, as if someone or something with disproportionate feet had walked around his tent while he slept. The footprints suddenly stopped, as if the creature had simply vanished into the air. Fear began to take over Luca, but he was stubborn and didn't want to give up. He pushed forward, despite the growing discomfort. As the days passed, the feeling of being pursued only intensified. During the day, he heard heavy footsteps echoing among the trees, but when he stopped to listen, the sound disappeared. At night, the lights returned, dancing among the shadows and lighting up the sky with an unsettling glow. It was on one of these nights that Luca realized he was not alone. As he tried to sleep, the tent suddenly was enveloped by an intense glow from outside. He quickly got up, his body shaking with fear, and peeked through the tent opening. What he saw left him paralyzed. A light so bright it seemed supernatural hovered among the trees. It made no noise, but its presence was overwhelming, as if it was draining all the energy from the environment. Luca tried to move, but it was as if his body was frozen. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it, but he couldn't move. The light seemed to slowly approach, and a sensation of absolute terror dominated him. At that moment, Luca knew something was there for him. It was not an animal, not a human being. It was something beyond comprehension. When he finally managed to move, Luca collapsed in his tent, his body trembling uncontrollably. The smell filling the air was nauseating, like something burnt and chemical at the same time, a mixture that made his eyes water and his skin crawl. He tried to write in his journal, but his hands were shaking so much that the words were barely legible. The fear that something was hunting him, something inhuman, was no longer a doubt. He knew it was there, and that it wouldn't let him go. The next day, Luca continued his hike, trying to get as far away from that place as possible, but with each step, he felt the presence of that being. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there in the shadows, lurking, waiting for the right moment. The trail, which had once seemed challenging, now seemed like a trap. Luca began to grow paranoid, looking over his shoulder every minute, feeling his mind was on the verge of collapse. The sound of his own footsteps seemed to be echoed by another set of steps, heavier, slower, but always there. Then, on the night of January 17th, Luca disappeared. When his family received no news, they alerted the authorities, who mobilized search teams to find him. The searches lasted days, but they found no sign of Luca. It was only on the morning of January 23rd that one of the rescue team members spotted something strange near a rocky hill. It was Luca's body, lying in a clearing, just a few meters from the main trail. But what truly shocked everyone was not the fact that he had died, it was the state in which his body was found. Luca's skin was pale, almost translucent, as if all the blood had been drained from his body. There were no signs of evident injuries, no marks of struggle, but his facial expression was one of pure terror. And around his body, the ground was marked by strange burns, as if something very hot had landed there, forming a perfect circle. Around where he fell, the smell of burning still hung in the air, and the ground around appeared to have been scorched, but there were no signs of fire. Luca's body looked emptied. There was no blood, no signs of hemorrhage, and the authorities couldn't explain what had happened. The official report was inconclusive, stating only that Luca Bianchi had died from unknown causes. But those who were part of the search knew there was something more. They had felt the same strange smell of burning and heard the rumors of the lights that danced through the sky that night. The mystery of his death soon became a local legend, and hikers began to avoid that stretch of the trail. The stories about the Appalachian Trail intensified after Luca's death. Some said he had been taken by something that inhabits the mountains for centuries, something that hunts those who venture deeply into its lands. Others believed he had fallen victim to an unexplained phenomenon, perhaps even extraterrestrial, that left marks on the ground and on Luca's body. What really happened that night, no one knows. But one thing is certain, the Appalachian Trail hides dark and mysterious secrets, and the death of Luca Bianchi remains one of the most disturbing enigmas of the trail. Those who walk there now do so with more caution, always looking to the sky and listening for footsteps that may not be their own. And the lights, they still appear, dancing among the trees, as if searching for their next victim. The lights. Always the lights. They continued to be spotted by those who dared to walk in the most remote parts of the Appalachian Trail, where the body of Luca Bianchi was found. Some hikers described an erratic glow that appeared and disappeared with a speed that defied any logic. Others spoke of an oppressive, almost paralyzing sensation when these lights appeared, as if the forest, for a brief moment, became completely still, trapped in a different dimension. But what they all had in common was the fear. It was not the common fear felt when walking alone in a wild place, but something more primitive, something visceral. After Luca's death, the trail in that area began to gain a sinister reputation. Local hikers and brave tourists passing through the section where he was found reported inexplicable sensations, a feeling of being watched, accompanied by an invisible presence. Some said the lights followed them for hours, appearing in the distance only to disappear when they tried to observe them closely. A group of 3 Italian hikers who knew of Luca's story decided, out of morbid curiosity, to explore the area in January 2019, exactly 1 year after the death of their compatriot. They were young, skeptical, and thought the stories were just exaggerated superstitions. "This is for those who can't handle the pressure of a trail like this," one of them commented as they crossed the snow-covered mountains. But soon, what was just a carefree adventure began to take a strange turn. On the 3rd night, close to the clearing where Luca was found, the group camped near a rocky hill. The air was cold, the kind of cold that freezes the bones, but the wind was unusually silent. During dinner, they noticed that the sky was exceptionally clear, the stars shining brightly. However, in the distance, something began to emerge. At first, it was just a faint light, like a star that seemed out of place. But within minutes, the light began to move, oscillating on the horizon as if it were alive. One of the guys laughed nervously, saying they were finally seeing what so many other hikers had described. But as the light approached, its brightness increased. It moved erratically, fast and unpredictable, as if it were searching for something, or someone. Everyone fell silent, watching the light that now seemed to dance among the trees, getting closer and closer. Then suddenly, it stopped. The light hovered directly above them, its intensity illuminating the entire area around them. The group, which until then had been quiet, began to feel the same discomfort that Luca Bianchi probably felt a year earlier. The air seemed denser, and the cold that was previously bothersome now became almost unbearable. It was as if the temperature had suddenly dropped, freezing the breath of the 3 young men. What happened next was etched in each of their memories like a nightmare that refused to disappear. The light, as if obeying its own will, began to descend slowly. It emitted no heat, just an intense and cold glow that blinded them. One of the young men tried to move, but found his body was completely paralyzed, as if an invisible force was holding him in place. The fear that followed was instant, an adrenaline rush that served no purpose, as none of them could even scream. At that moment, the youngest of the group, Marco, began to hear something. It was a low guttural sound, like a growl coming from somewhere within the light. The sound was hypnotic and terrifying at the same time. When he finally managed to turn his head, what he saw was enough to stop his heart. On the edge of the light, a vaguely human figure, but deformed and too large, stood still. Its eyes glowed with an intensity similar to the light, and its long arms swung slowly. Was it the same creature that Luca had described in his diary? Marco didn't know, but the sight of that figure made his blood run cold. He felt that it was not of this world, and that there was nothing he could do to escape. He knew they were at the mercy of something incomprehensible and inhuman. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light disappeared in the blink of an eye, as if it had never existed. The group remained there, paralyzed, trembling, still processing what had just happened. When they finally managed to move, they were dazed, speechless. They dismantled their camp and ran through the forest, not looking back. The next day, when they reached the nearest village, they could barely speak about what had happened. The fear was etched on their faces, and the experience they had that night would haunt their dreams for the following years. None of them dared to return to the Appalachian Trail. And although they recounted their stories in detail, few believed them, thinking they were exaggerating or that the terror of the trail had simply distorted their perception. But the marks were there. When a new exploration team passed through the clearing weeks later, they found the ground burned again, as if something incredibly hot had touched the soil. The same circular marks that had been found around the body of Luca Bianchi a year earlier were present again, mysterious and unexplained. The smell of burning and the dense air impregnated with something strange, as if the place was marked by an energy that did not belong to this world. Reports about the lights continued, as did the growing fear that something or someone was hunting hikers in that area. What happened to Luca Bianchi became an increasingly silent warning. Those who dared to venture deep into the mountains of the Appalachian Trail knew it wasn't just the isolation or treacherous terrain that posed a danger. It was something else, something that no human was capable of understanding. Luca had been just the first of many to discover this in the cruelest way possible. And as the years passed, the lights continued to dance in the night sky, waiting for their next victim. Report 4. Margaret Maggie Warren, a 58-year-old woman from Oregon, had always been fascinated by nature and tales of remote places. From a young age, she sought outdoor adventures, feeling more alive among ancient trees and silent mountains than in the hustle of urban life. In 1993, she decided to tackle one of the biggest challenges of her life, to complete a trail on the legendary Appalachian Trail alone. For Maggie, the trail was not just a test of physical endurance, but also a way to reconnect with herself after years of personal loss and challenges. The Appalachian Trail was known for its natural beauties, but also for dark stories that circulated among hikers. At every stop, Maggie heard whispers of legends about hikers who disappeared, mysterious lights that appeared at night, and figures lurking in the shadows. Despite the warnings, Maggie was unfazed. She was experienced and rational, and she didn't believe in superstitions. However, the trail she was about to tackle, a section known for being one of the most remote and difficult, had already claimed many lives. Right from the start, Maggie felt the isolation. The first few days were peaceful, with the sound of leaves moved by the wind and birds singing. But as night fell, the sensation of being completely alone in a silent vastness began to weigh on her. On the third night, while setting up camp in a clearing near a rocky hill, Maggie began to feel something strange in the air. The silence was disturbing. There were no animal sounds, not even the rustling of leaves. It was as if the forest around her was holding its breath. As she organized her supplies, Maggie noticed a shadow moving between the trees. It was quick, but enough to make her freeze for a moment. She blinked, trying to convince herself it was just an illusion caused by fatigue, but the discomfort didn't leave her. Determined not to be dominated by fear, she entered her tent and tried to sleep. The problem was, as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard something, footsteps, heavy and rhythmic, around her camp. Her heart raced. When she finally gathered the courage to go out and investigate, there was nothing, just the echo of her own steps. The next day, the sensation of being watched intensified. At every turn on the trail, Maggie felt a growing weight, as if something or someone was following her steps. But every time she turned around, what she found was the emptiness of the trees and the oppressive silence. The wind blew sporadically, carrying whispers that seemed to be more than just murmurs of the forest. When night fell again, Maggie tried to use her radio to contact local authorities and check her route, but the radio was silent. She turned the knob several times, trying to tune into some signal, but all she got was static. Suddenly, a voice whispered through the hiss, something she couldn't completely understand. The words were distorted, as if coming from a distant place, but something was wrong. It wasn't a human voice. It was something deeper, hoarse, almost metallic. Panic began to grow within her, but Maggie, trying to remain calm, turned off the radio, believing it was just interference. Later that night, as she prepared to sleep, she saw something she would never forget. The forest around her camp seemed to be moving. Among the trees, dark figures passed quickly, as if they were watching her from afar. She tried to follow the movement with her eyes, but the figures disappeared as quickly as they appeared. Her body was on high alert, and she felt fear creeping up her spine. The air seemed denser, charged with something unknown. The metallic smell that now permeated the environment only heightened her sense of imminent danger. Determined to abandon the camp, Maggie quickly gathered her things and began walking in the darkness, with her flashlight swinging in her trembling hands. The sound of breaking branches and rustling leaves seemed closer, and each step she took seemed to be echoed by another, as if something invisible was closely following her. Trying to keep her mind focused, she turned on the radio again. This time, there was a different static, more intense. And amid that static, a strange voice began to emerge again. The words, though disjointed, were clear enough to cause chills. "Return, there is no escape." The voice seemed displaced, as if it were stuck between this world and another, and Maggie, unable to understand what was happening, dropped the radio. She felt panic taking over her body, but knew she needed to keep moving. It was during the early hours that everything worsened. Walking the trail, tired and exhausted, Maggie realized that the shadows were closing in more and more. The light from her flashlight began to fail, flickering intermittently. In the last flash of light, she saw a tall, distorted figure among the trees, its eyes glowing with unnatural intensity. Whatever it was moving towards her with a calculated slowness, as if it knew she had nowhere to go. She began to run, her lungs burning with the cold night air. The trail ahead seemed endless, the trees closing in around her as if they wanted to imprison her there forever. Maggie stumbled several times but always got up, driven by the sheer force of survival. Report 4. Pure survival instinct. The words from the radio echoed in her mind. There is no escape, and the fear now was unbearable. When the day finally began to break, Maggie found a small clearing. Her body was exhausted, her mind on the verge of collapse. She knew she couldn't go on, so she sat down, trying to catch her breath. But even in the light of morning, the forest did not seem any less menacing. The air was still heavy, and the metallic smell persisted. At that moment, the sensation that something was with her became unbearable. Maggie tried to stand up, but her body seemed to have given up. She looked around for any sign of life, but all she saw were the shadows that seemed to be lurking. The last words she heard before succumbing to exhaustion were those coming from the radio, which inexplicably began to work again. "Now you are ours." The disappearance of Maggie Warren became a mystery. Her body was found days later, but in strange and disturbing conditions. What remained of her was pale, drained of blood, with no signs of external injuries. Around her final camp, the ground was scorched, forming a perfect circle, as if something incredibly hot or supernatural had landed there. The radio was recovered beside her body, still operating, but on a frequency that no one could identify. The words that Maggie had heard were never fully understood, and what really happened that night remains a subject of speculation. The legends about the Appalachian Trail gained more strength after her death, with more hikers claiming to see strange lights and hear whispered voices among the trees. Some say that Maggie fell victim to something ancient that lives in the depths of those mountains, hunting the unwary. Others believe she entered a territory that should never have been explored. But one thing is certain, what happened to Maggie Warren was not natural. And the forest, with all its secrets, keeps what really took her. To this day, those who hike the Appalachian Trail report feeling watched, monitored by something that never shows itself, but is always there, waiting for its next victim. Report 5. In the middle of 1962, the Texas heat was stifling, but not even that could stop Tommy Cooper, a 45-year-old man, from deciding to take his family on a camping trip to the mountains in the northern part of the state, a remote area he had heard about since childhood as being known for legends and strange occurrences. His wife, Linda, and their children Billy, 10, and Sarah, 8, were excited for the adventure. The destination chosen was a secluded stretch on Green Pine Ridge, a region rarely visited, shrouded in mystery and stories of inexplicable disappearances. There was something special about that area. Locals completely avoided it, always whispering about strange lights seen at night, noises echoing in the mountains, and of course the disappearances. One of the most disturbing stories was about a man named Carl Anderson, whose body was found in 1955, completely dehydrated and without a drop of blood, as if it had been drained by something. Besides him, there was the case of Martha Wheeler, a young woman who disappeared in 1958 while on a short hike. Not even a trace of her whereabouts was ever found. The natives of the region spoke little, but they always mentioned the Starmen, referring to beings who, according to local belief, came from the stars and abducted those who dared to enter their lands. Tommy, however, was skeptical. To him, these stories were just folklore, exaggerations of superstitious minds. He had planned the trip as a moment of reconnection with nature and with his family, unconcerned with the rumors. Armed with flashlights, an old map of the region, and supplies for the week, he led his family deep into the mountains. Right from the first day, the air around them seemed strangely still. Even with a strong sun, there was no wind, and the silence of the forest was absolute, interrupted only by the children's footsteps and occasional laughter. As night fell, after setting up camp, Tommy lit a fire. They sat around it, and he began to tell stories from his childhood, trying to lighten the weight of the strange atmosphere around them. However, as twilight advanced, everyone began to feel something different in the air, a indescribable tension. It was Billy who first noticed something in the sky. "Dad, what is that?" he pointed. Everyone looked up to see a bright light on the horizon, moving erratically. It wasn't an airplane or a star. It was something else. The light swayed in the sky, dancing in a way that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Linda, who had maintained a calm demeanor until then, began to feel a chill run down her spine. "Tommy, what is that?" she asked, her voice choked. Tommy tried to calm the family, saying it was probably a satellite or some kind of military aircraft being tested, but deep down, he also felt fear growing. That light did not behave like anything he had ever seen before. Then, without warning, the light disappeared in a fraction of a second, leaving the sky dark and the silence even more oppressive. Later that same night, while everyone tried to sleep, Tommy was awakened by a strange noise coming from the forest. It was a low, vibrating sound, like a metallic hum, something he had never heard before. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the tent to investigate, but as soon as he stepped outside, the sound ceased. He looked around and noticed that the air was different. There was no wind, and the temperature had dropped drastically. That was when he saw a figure in the distance, among the trees. A tall, slender figure that seemed to be watching the camp. Tommy Frotze. It wasn't an animal, he knew that. Trying to keep calm, he pointed the flashlight in the direction of the figure, but the moment the light touched it, it disappeared as if it had never been there.